Are we on? Yes, we are. My name is Tomáš Valášek. I'm director of Carnegie Europe, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's conversation, discussion, brainstorming, reflection, whatever we call it. We like to keep them informal and not stick to any particular categories. On global challenges, picking on a specific issue of corruption today. And I have a particular pleasure to introduce my colleague from the Carnegie family, Sarah Chase. Sarah is one of those people who probably needs a little introduction in the community of people who deal with Eastern Europe, developing world, and the issue of corruption. She is somewhere between very well known and a legend. I'll confess to having liked your book, Thieves of State, which is 2 years ago now, a year and a half. Yeah. So much. It was a gift for my wife on her on a Christmas. Yes.
Oh wow, that's tough.
Your particular research, or your research for the past 6 months, has been on what you describe basically as a novel form of corruption. You write about corruption not as sort of an aberration or an exception from a system, but corruption that really is the system or has become the system. And you really challenge the way we think about the issue. Because whereas we often think of a solution to corruption as essentially throwing out a few bumps and bad seeds out of the offices and simply letting the sort of inner workings of the democracy do their work, you challenge that and you basically say no. In some instances, and not just a small group of countries, you describe a picture in which 60 countries, literally more than a third of the, or just a little less than a third of the world's community of countries, have fallen into the trap of, again, the corruption essentially becoming part of a system in which the governments and the other centers of power, whether it's the economic centers, the businesses, and the financial centers, work in complete collusion on scamming, taking their 10%, 5%, whatever the money is. What you essentially argue is that what you need is not just a pinprick solution and a removal of a functionary or any somewhat improved judiciary. What you essentially argue is you need a basically complete political upheaval and a political cleansing, if you will, to address challenges in those countries. I'll let you develop the argument further yourself. I will not steal any more of the content of this excellent report, which if you don't have in front of you, there should be copies on a shelf. And after speaking to Sarah, I have the pleasure of welcoming also on the panel Frederick Carlson, who will talk to us about the global center's work on the center's work on global challenges, and specifically about a novel way you have found on enticing the public interest and public contributions to helping you intellectually with the work of addressing global governance. And I want to explore to what extent the issue of corruption is something that plays a role in your search for a better arrangement of global governance, and to what extent you think global governance may be part of the answer to some of the challenges that Sarah describes. But the order of things is we begin with Sarah, we move on to Frederick, and then I want to open up after a few follow-up questions to broader conversations. As ever, we have until 8, so a little less than an hour and a half for the conversations. And with that, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Good evening to everyone. Indeed, 60, something like 60. And what, I feel like even when we're talking about corruption as something scary and dangerous and bad, the metaphors we tend to use, very often disease metaphors, right? Cancer of corruption, epidemic, corrosion. It's almost like the assumption is, or the implication is, that you have a body politic that's basically sound and that's being eaten away somehow by this nasty thing called corruption. So if you could cure it, then the body politic sort of goes out of place. The other thing, and I'm speaking, obviously you can hear my accent as an American, we Americans love to create these great barriers between licit actors and bad guys, right? Be they criminals, be they terrorists, those are bad guys. And the licit actors, we also get into these wonderful arguments about which is worse for your health, the public sector or the private sector, right? Americans will just tear each other's eyes out about And what I found so difficult in that context to sort of absorb is the degree to which corrupt systems erase those boundaries. So this report is about Honduras, but it's only about Honduras as an example of a phenomenon. I did an earlier and much shallower one about some countries more in this area that some of you may have, I think, may have been here to talk about. Yes, I see some familiar faces. And it was Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Kyrgyzstan. This is a deeper look. It's still, you'll see it's still a kind of test drive. It's still a incomplete effort. But what you find is that these are kleptocratic networks that blur the boundaries, as Tomasz suggested, between public and private sectors. So you have either members of the same family that overlap entirely between the major public, the main levers of power and the main sort of rent extraction opportunities in the private sector, and then also the criminal sector. We didn't quite cross paths, but could have in Afghanistan, where I lived for nearly a decade in Kandahar, where, the president's half-brother was running much of the opium business in southern Afghanistan. And the president's other brothers were running massive construction companies that were getting a lot of the US contracting. So it's this, and in the past when I've looked at this, I've tended to focus on the vertical integration of the system, which is also surprising, because we've all been to countries where you get shaken down for bribes on the street, and there's a tendency to say, oh, that's just petty bribery, that's just petty corruption, let's not worry about it. Whereas what I discovered in Afghanistan, in Nigeria, and other places is that people take a cut. If I'm a street-level police officer, yes, I can shake you down, but I owe you, my precinct captain, a percentage of what I take from you. And in fact, a recent study on Nigeria showed that it's obligatory, that you don't stay in the police if you're not providing bribes up the line. So that's the vertical integration, but this really looks at the horizontal integration. And what I found is, of course, different countries, the network will have a different structure and a different degree of internal rivalry, and therefore a kind of, I want to say, turbulence may be different in different countries. In Honduras, what I found was that the public and private sectors are not identical the way they are in, let's say, Azerbaijan. They're not exactly identical, but they're very close. It overlaps very heavily. Here you have the main private sector network members are relatively culturally homogeneous. They often come from early 20th century immigrants from the Levant. And that culture, has stayed relatively kind of endogamous, if I can put it that way. They tend to intermarry. They tend to exchange positions on each other's boards of directors and things like that. Now, they will place individuals into high government office quite often, including the president at least once, foreign ministry, very key places. So you have that degree of separation. In other countries, as I say, it's quite overlapping. In some countries, it's quite top-down. Ben Ali's Tunisia, very tightly controlled from the sort of center. In others, less so. Kyrgyzstan, for example, much more turbulent. In some cases, Moldova, the private sector really kind of runs it, or Indonesia, which I'm looking at the moment. It's much more, the impulsion is coming from the private sector network members who basically put relatively subservient people into public office. And so then the other thing that this really changes in terms of how to think about corruption is, instead of seeing corruption as an exchange of money on a punctual basis for a specific discrete action, which is how it's been defined in the United States, very narrowly, quid pro quo, the public sector network members perform a function which is to bend through repeated actions and decisions, to bend elements of state function or agencies, government agencies or institutions, to serve the purposes of the network. And so that's what this is kind of about. It's quite schematic. I don't get to an actual network diagram, which I'm dying to do, like maybe the next country where you've got the names of the people in the different spheres. But here, as you'll see, and this thing is in the back of the report, but the point is this is an interwoven network. Blue is public sector, green is private sector, red is criminal sector, and then we break it down. So here, Congress, completely taken over by the kleptocratic network. In fact, the current president was president of Congress, passed a whole bunch of laws right before he became president to facilitate the type of activities of the network members. You always need to ensure impunity for your networks, so the judiciary is either going to get captured, as in the case of Honduras, where, again, in the middle of the night, 4 Supreme Court justices were fired, I mean, it's pretty out there. But in the case of Egypt, for example, the judiciary retains a degree of independence. So then the network has figured out how to work around it. President Sisi is in the process of vastly expanding the jurisdiction of military courts. It's how you just, in the United States, we've got a whole segment of our economy that is sent to private justice. So if you sign a cell phone contract in the United States, in the fine print, you find out that you no longer have access to the courts if you have a grievance against the cell phone company. You go to private arbitration, and it's the cell phone company that appoints the arbitrators. So you have a privatization of significant, yeah, no kidding. And it's not just cell phones. It came as a shock to me when I found out too. You always need an instrument of force. In the case of Honduras, it's quite interesting. The police play that role, but President Hernandez is in the process of blurring the lines between elite military and police units. They're sent out on missions together. Sometimes they change uniforms. They're trained together, often by U.S. Special Forces and things like that. There's something called the Qualianza, which is a commission that selects likely projects for public-private partnerships. So here's another thing, right? We all hear about how wonderful public-private partnerships are, but in the wrong hands, those can precisely serve the overlapping functions that I'm talking about. Anyway, so you can go through, there's a whole set of these oversight bodies. Environment ministries often get hollowed out, if you will. Any institution that could provide an independent oversight is either worked around or hollowed out or whatever. And because so much rent seeking on the part of these networks is related to land use, because it's either public land, so tourism, high-end real estate, high-end construction, luxury, those types of sectors, but also natural resources, hydropower even is kind of coming back these days, and we can talk about that. But therefore, environment ministries need to be undermined. The private sector in Honduras includes, but I find this again almost everywhere, finance. Serbia may be I was in Serbia recently talking about this, and I heard there that almost all the banks in Serbia are foreign. So that was interesting to me, and I don't know, I haven't checked it out, but I was like, wow, could Serbia be the exception to that one? But the finance sector is a critical one. Energy, critical, and that even counts where there is, of course, where there's hydrocarbons, Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Venezuela, even, again, subnationally in some of the countries that don't usually qualify as very corrupt. Palm oil in Honduras turns out to be a big one, also in Indonesia. A lot of export agriculture. So green beans in Kenya. What you find is subsistence farmers get pushed off the land so that the network can take over the land to do the cash generating work. As I said, construction, high-end real estate, that kind of thing. Anyway, there are those other ones. And then, of course, like Afghanistan, I mean, I knew the Karzais very well. I was in Ahmed Wali Karzai's house, you know, for a certain period almost every night for dinner, except when the drug dealers came over. Then Sarah, like, let's deter Sarah from coming over for dinner. And it took me a couple of years, actually, to catch on to what was going on. But, you know, so the narcotics sector, obviously, for all of Central America is a really significant one, Honduras. Interestingly, the current president gets some kudos for reducing the kind of virulence of the narcotics trade in Honduras. My hypothesis is that he's from a different region, and so he wasn't himself, you know, tangled up already in those networks. And then, and we can talk about this a bit more, but this diagram has these little dots on the outside, and maybe we can pick that up later, but there are external factors working on systems like this. But that's what I mean by this type of an actual integrated system.
Can I jump into the sort of outline dots right away? You made the point twice, in fact, that the United States was so perhaps an unwitting part of the corruption story in Afghanistan. I should have pointed out in your intro that you, of course, served as advisor to chairman of a Joint Chiefs of Staff and 2 ISAF commanders. So your Afghanistan experience is rooted in an awful lot of time on the ground. But my question is neither about Afghanistan nor the U.S. alone for the time being. My question is about the broader issue of enablers, because you have a concept in your report of enablers who, whether through naivete or through laziness or possibly willful collusion, make it possible for corruption to reach the pervasive levels that it does. And it struck me that perhaps the way we sometimes think about corruption in this town in Brussels is some way deficient and limited. We tend to, the stories one reads about corruption in Politico, in the European press, tend to focus on the overseer, whether it's the governance failure and oversight failures on the part of those who distribute money, the European Commission funds not being audited or the auditor refusing to sign off, because it fits in a broader story of European officials not being efficient and a different agenda, perhaps. A trope, exactly. Yeah. But it seems to me, from reading your report, the lesson I drew is we're missing out on a bigger story, which is the effect that a poor oversight has on the countries on the receiving end, in a sense of enabling what is, in many ways, for lack of a better word, a perverted political economic structure to emerge. And you don't let us off the hook. You are quite tough on the enablers. Can you develop that?
Yeah, and I learned a lot doing this story, and partly because this report, partly I actually avoided some of the, as you all can imagine, Honduras and the United States have a long and tangled and ugly history, ugly from the perspective of the United States as far as I'm concerned. I wanted to, in some regard, sidestep that because it's really been, it's a rut, and people are already, the positions on what they think about that relationship are very hardened and things like that. So, and because I spent a lot of time here in Europe, I did actually look at European support. So let me not let the United States off the hook. The U.S. provides a lot of civilian assistance, but the most damaging interaction between the U.S. and Honduras, in my view, has been on the military side. in a variety of ways over time. I mean, both when the El Salvador and Nicaragua wars were going on, poor Honduras is sitting in the middle and is supposed to be, you know, on one side on one war and on the other side on the other, you know, and so there's all of that ongoing military assistance. But I sort of didn't go too deep into that. The civilian humanitarian assistance, I was really startled by the point of view, by the almost attitude, and in particular, development financing, which has become a little bit à la mode, you know, because we've all decided as our development, civilian assistance budgets are going down, oh, how do we mobilize more money? It's again a public-private partnership. Let's do development financing. So I picked on one of my favorite countries in the world, Finland. Do we have any Finns in the room? No? Incredibly wonderful place, wonderful people. I almost regret, you know, but FinFund had been a donor. What pushed me into this whole effort was the assassination of an unbelievable woman named Berta Cáceres. If any of you have ever not heard of her, just look her up when you go home. I would almost, once I got to know more about her going to Honduras, I found her almost like a Central American Nelson Mandela. I know the comparison is overused, but she was an amazing person, an indigenous activist with a very broad view of what mattered. So she worked particularly on environmental issues. But for her, it was part of an almost, as you say, a political economy kind of issue. Anyway, I had wanted to think about how does corruption exacerbate environmental destruction, heard about her assassination, said, I need to look at this. So one of the donors for the project over which she was assassinated was FinFund. So I go to Finland and I talk to the folks at the bank, the foreign ministry and the bank. So what happens is the foreign ministry gives money to the bank. The bank, you know, with a certain number of requirements, you know, this is development money, it needs to go into development, et cetera. So there's a kind of cahier de charge, a sort of, you know, set of criteria. The FinFund often will take some of its money, and in this case, it was secret from the people of Finland, how much money they put into then an intermediate fund with other donors, which is called the Central America CAMIF Mezzanine Infrastructure Fund, to do infrastructure. FinFund provides a certain number of, you know, guidance to CAMIF, but of course it's watered down because there are a number of other donors. So already the Finnish government is now 2 stages away. CAMIF is managed by straight up money managers who live in Washington, who, oh, by the way, also manage the money of the Sultan of Brunei. At every stage in the process, the development requirements are watered down and the oversight is minimized. So I went and visited every one of the people down this chain, and I would ask, what reporting do you require of your, you know, of the people you're giving this money to? Oh, biannual, semi-annual, they have to do, you know. And I say, and do you verify anything that, like, do you ever check? Oh, we don't have any reason to spot check. We trust our clients. So trust was the word that every single, down to, you know, Latin America partners in Washington who say, oh, we trust our clients. And it was really stunning to me. And so a woman was assassinated. She was like the 3rd person who had been assassinated over this project. As I was walking away from the FinFund people, I said, you know, did you think about, what did you learn from this experience? In the end, FinFund has canceled, you know, its participation in this project. FMO are there any Dutch in the room? No Dutch in the room? So FMO is another, yeah. And I didn't go to FMO because it was easier to pick on the Finns because they're smaller and, you know, and I got what I needed, right? You know, the Dutch, you know, like, so I, you know, said, did you learn anything from this? And they said, yeah. We learned that it's not good enough to have a good project. you have to think about the environment, the context within which this project takes place. I thought, yay, they learned something. They said, you really have to know whether there's a powerful NGO that's got lots of friends worldwide, you know, who can raise a ruckus. And I said, are you kidding me? So the person who's the bad guy here is the small, you know, community. It's not that small, but it's a community organization. Because they were able to actually have their voice heard, they become the bad guy. So who is it that this investment is actually trying to help, if not these people? So that was a pretty, you know, and it's a bit of an anecdotal answer to your question, but more broadly, what I found is that these networks, particularly in countries that don't have hydrocarbons or some massive natural resource, what's the best source of rents? External inputs. So they organize themselves to capture the external inputs, be they development funds or, frankly, European support funds, right? I mean, we can talk about that in a minute, too. But to the point that Nigerians, who are pretty funny people, have come up with an expression for how these networks capture international development money. They talk about gongos. A gongo is a government-organized, non-governmental organization, right? You know. And what's so devastating about this is that what you end up, and so again, the argument that we donors or development actors often tell ourselves is, and that's what the FinFund people said, was I want people to have electricity, and if I have to hold my nose and work with some crooked people so that the ordinary population gets electricity, so be it. Except that's not how it actually works. The ordinary people don't get the electricity. So it's not the cost of doing business argument doesn't make sense anymore when we're talking about this, because what you're actually doing with that money is reinforcing and enabling this type of a system. Then you have, you know, some of the other obvious enablers are people like Mossack and Fonseca, if any of you read the Panama Papers. You know, you actually have service providers. So I gave a talk like this recently to, would you believe, the International Academy of Estate and Trust Lawyers. You know, and I was trying to be nice, you know, but they're sort of tell us how we can make the argument that blanket transparency of, you know, beneficial ownership is a bad idea. I'm like, I'm probably not the right person to ask for your argument, but it was interesting to at least be in the room with them and sort of say, look, and they were all saying, of course, none of our clients do anything, and you know, do anything like that. I'm saying, of course, your clients would never do. And someone said, you know, they might.
Sarah, I want to move on to Frederick and the bigger global challenges, but not before giving you, in the interest of equal opportunity, a chance to pick on another continent, because you've picked on a Latin American country, on a European country. I want to ask you about your own. The network you described and the mechanism you described, you know, people in political power, very close to people with business power and money, often bearing the same name, and colluding to self-serving purposes. Doesn't that, you know, hit awfully close to home these days?
Does it ever? So, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a foreign policy think tank. And I'm like, so my boss's name is also Thomas, and I'm like knocking on his door saying, all right, how do I get to work on, like, I can't work on corruption in Ethiopia, which is the next country, like, you know, when you've got family members in government who are also still in business, you've got the president who has business operations in at least half a dozen kleptocracies. So when my president is building hotels, therefore engaging in exchanges with, because you don't do luxury real estate in a country like Indonesia or a country like Panama or a country like Philippines, they're one of these. So you don't do luxury real estate without either being woven into the network or doing a pay-to-play. It's one or the other. That means my president is either receiving, he's either a member of the network or he's receiving what we call emoluments, meaning prohibited items of value from foreign governments, or he's violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, I can go down that road a little bit too and say, isn't it interesting that the United States prosecutes companies for bribing foreign governments when the United States government bribes foreign governments? But that's a whole other question. But personally, and then let's look at the overlap. I mean, if I were doing one of these, which I might on the United States, we've got ExxonMobil runs our foreign ministry. We've got a bank in a place very well known for money laundering who's now our Secretary of Commerce. We've got, the overlap between rent-producing industries and the US government is so significant today that I have a hard time doing my job, frankly, as a foreign policy person. And some of the other things that I described, what were the first things to be done by the US president? It was, let's roll back regulations on the environmental impacts of hydrocarbon stuff. What else did he decide to do? Let's vitiate the Environmental Protection Agency. I had already done this with where I've got CERNA in Honduras. The environmental ministry is called CERNA, saying it's classic that environmental ministries get hollowed out. So is ours. The judiciary. The degree of frontal attack on the judiciary that's, again, presidents have always complained about judges, decisions. That's a little bit different from going after the judiciary as an institution the way this one has. So let me just say that the parallels are almost sickening. It almost physically makes one feel a little bit ill as a human being, as a citizen of a country, that where before you could sort of say, golly, my country makes a lot of bad decisions, or this president I don't like, or whatever, but you kind of had faith in the structure.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that.
Well, thanks for that candor, because while the state of governance, to put it that way, in the United States may make your life difficult, I think your ability to look at your own country with the critical eye gives you a lot of credibility then to discuss other countries' difficulties. So thank you for that candor and the openness on the last question in particular. Frederick, I want to move on to you. We'll have a chance to come back on many of the issues in the reports, and I'm sure there is a million unexplored questions on the role of corruption in affecting and perhaps, to use the word again, perverting political systems even within the European Union through cohesion funds, and I hope we get back to that. But before that, Frederick, I want to enlarge the debate. First of all, Frederick Carlson, real pleasure. You could step in at the last minute. Many thanks. Many of you have noticed that you're not your colleague who had an unfortunate foot injury. So, Frederick, thank you for stepping in at the last person. You're, of course, the manager for the SHAPE, or the project leader for the SHAPE Prize at the Global Challenges Foundation. And we wanted to bring the link to two conversations because in some ways we have a habit of putting the analyst of the practical in the same conversation with those who think about the system in a way to explore whether there's a systemic solution to the issues that we discuss on hand. When Sarah told me early in the conversation the astonishing figure, 60 countries of the world, again, fitting the description that you've just given us, it struck me this is a global challenge. When you're talking 60 countries of the world whose political system has been so warped that through corruption, with inevitable consequences in terms of lost and foregone economic opportunities, the storing up for potential social explosion. How long can you have this rent-seeking arrangement sitting on the top of a country before the population revolts? And for example, see Tunisia and elsewhere. So it struck me listening to Sarah, this is truly a global challenge. I understand your center defines global challenges somewhat differently. You're looking primarily at the risks. But to what extent does corruption figure among the global challenges that you're looking at? And to what extent do you see the link between the two issues?
Sure, thank you very much. And thank you, Sarah, for that introduction to your work. It's truly daunting to listen to the way you're describing the problem. With my background working in development cooperation and humanitarian response, and now looking at global governance, it's obviously at the center of some of the challenges we're looking at. And so what we're doing at the Global Challenges Foundation is looking at primarily global catastrophic risks, the kind of low probability but high impact occasions that could have existential level risk. And we're looking at how to tackle those kind of risks.
Could you just give an example, like an example
Yeah.
of one? Because you did mention before you're talking about the death of, let's say,
Yeah.
some very large number. But what could cause such a thing? Like what's on your guys' list?
Sure. So there are quite a few common suspects, and there are some emerging ones, and so on and so forth. But obviously, the most obvious one is climate change. I mean, we've been working extensively with a couple of centers in Oxford and Cambridge, working on existential risks primarily, and the definition is something that has an impact that could threaten the life of 10% of the global population. That's an existential risk. And traditionally, these kinds of risks were all low probability but high impact. And so they tended to fall out of the scope of the kind of attention on the political agenda. And even we are, as humans, we are kind of wired not to take these kind of risks into account. We tend to be more close to home when we look at risks. But so, unfortunately, today, a catastrophic scenario of climate change is no longer very low probability. Even with if we would, the pledges at the Paris Agreement, if we actually would implement them all, we would still be on a track towards somewhere, fairly beyond a 3 degrees Celsius warming of the planet, and with quite a few of the risks connected with global warming being of exponential rather than a linear nature, we don't really know what the probability of a catastrophic scenario of climate change is. But some other examples would be, severe pandemics. You have natural events like supervolcanoes or asteroid hits, and these kind of events that could have the same kind of impact. But we also have things connected to nuclear arms, obviously. And so, but increasingly through our work that started out really about raising awareness about these kinds of risks because they tended to fall off the political agenda. Increasingly, of course, climate change has kind of entered the stage and done what we're doing more acute. And so we are currently looking a lot at what are the kind of structures in terms of global governance needed to address these kind of risks.
And you've come up with an interesting way of incentivizing others to help you with the search for the structure. Tell us more about the price.
Yes. So we're not a think tank primarily. We try to be a facilitator of a global dialogue. And so at the center of that work right now is a prize competition that we call A New Shape, that we launched at Chatham House in November, and since then been touring the world. And this is part of that, trying to raise awareness about this prize, which is essentially about catalyzing, creative and transformative thinking on global governance. It's obvious to us and to most people we engage with that there is a certain, very clear need for effective global governance to tackle global risks. Obviously, and that ties very much to what Sarah's been describing. We also need legitimate governance. And so the tension between effective and legitimate global governance makes it a very, very tricky issue. And I think that's obviously why we don't see a more robust global governance. It's really, really difficult to put something in place that would be perceived and actually deliver in a way that would be legitimate. So,
can I push you on the subject, Frederick? Because
yes.
we had a conversation earlier in my office on global responses to corruption. And Sarah made a point that struck me as true, though you'll have better insights, which is that it's incredibly difficult to design global governance responses to corruption, because by definition, global governance solutions are made by the participating countries, which must, by definition, if it's a global solution, include some of the guilty parties, if you will. And of course, the Turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas. The countries that are guilty are going to seek to water down whatever the arrangement is in place, whether it is a treaty, whether it's a convention, whether it's an understanding or an agreement, to the point where they are not going to be credibly persecuted.
Yeah.
Or, failing that, they're going to ignore attempts at persecution for what is a violation of an internationally agreed convention. So, to be blunt and to be pushing a little bit, is effective global governance an unobtainable goal?
And I would even say, even if it's not global governance aimed at the corruption issue, but if you say, in order to be part of this club that will be focused on climate change, there's some minimal standards. And so often with multinational organizations, including various European structures, it gets to be, once someone's in the club, it's, the standards aren't imposed on them. So have you guys thought about how to address those issues?
I would say where we are at the moment is really that we see our task primarily right now to pose this challenge to the best and the brightest out there. And so what we're trying to do is to, with the prize competition that is essentially called to come up with innovative solutions to tackle global risks through global governance. And there is a money incentive. There's a $5 million award to be distributed among a few winners, which will be awarded in May in Stockholm next year. And so what we're hoping to achieve here, and we really, is a starting gun of a sustained dialogue on these issues, because we do not sit on the silver bullet here, and we realize that this is a genuinely tricky issue. So we certainly need to pull in ideas and thinking from all sectors of society. And I'm really happy to note that among the more than 13,000 registrants in the competition this far, it closes at the end of September this year. But we already have quite a few intersectoral, international kind of super teams trying to crack this challenge. And so really this question is at the core of the challenge, because what we often say is that there are two basic criteria for the challenge, and it's about finding governance solutions that are both effective and legitimate. And there's an obvious tension between those two.
There's a bunch of tension. Sorry to
And
jump
corruption
like
is at
this.
the core.
Well, right, because there's legitimate to whom. And again, I'm sure you heard this as often as I did. For example, I kept hearing the Afghans. And I'm like, okay, what Afghans? Because the Afghan government is not legitimate in the eyes of the Afghan people, or it's not appreciated by the Afghan people. So when you say the Afghans, do you mean the Afghan? And of course, it usually stood for the Afghan government with the implicit sort of Western assumption that the Afghan government represents the interests of the Afghan people. So when you talk about legitimacy, you're going to have and then President Karzai kept saying, you are, impinging on our sovereignty, which worked really well on Westerners, whereas my ordinary Afghan friends are saying, what sovereignty? Who, like, are you kidding me? This guy's on life support from you guys. So the sovereignty already doesn't exist. We can't run this country, so don't let him, you know, twist your nose about sovereignty. That's a bunch of junk. But you're going to get government saying, this isn't legitimate because my interests aren't, whereas the populations of the same country may have a different. And then I was just listening to your list. So with the exception of the asteroid, pandemic, let's look at Ebola. To what extent was the damage that Ebola wreaked, or whatever, wrought, or whatever the past tense of wreak is, right, on West Africa, how much was it amplified by the corrupt pillaging of the health systems? So it's not just that corrupt governments didn't bother to have a health system. It was they actively pillaged the health systems because that's where there was a lot of money. Same thing happened in Honduras, where the whole public health sector, that was a gigantic scandal that almost made the government, you know, kind of wobble, was when people realized the health sector was being pillaged to the point that people were dying because the medicine was fake medicine. So, pandemic, it's intimately affected by corruption. Nuclear, right? I mean, so A.Q. Khan, anyone heard of him? The guy, the Pakistani guy who basically gave nuclear technology to... That was not an individual Pakistani. That was, again, a kind of government kleptocratic system. Global warming. I mean, again, let's go back to the United States. So first thing that happens is ExxonMobil owns a big piece of the US government. I get it. The guy's no longer the CEO of ExxonMobil. The guy walked into, I'm talking about our foreign minister, Rex Tillerson. The guy walked into ExxonMobil at the age of 23. He walked out 41 years later, having been the CEO during some very questionable activities by that company, to become U.S. foreign minister. I don't believe, for me it's not an issue anymore of whether he personally has a personal conflict of interest. The guy doesn't know anybody else's interest except ExxonMobil's interest. Therefore, what happens? We pull out of Paris. Keystone XL happens. Dakota Access Pipeline happens. Stream protection rule. I mean, it was an unbelievable thing to live through. Was the first couple of months of just assault on environmental protections and environmental, you know, that happened within the. So global warming, because gas and oil are such an incredible source of rents, it, you know, or climate change. Sorry. It's an immediate issue. The issue of, as I said, I'm not sure if I said it here, what blew me away in Honduras, there isn't any gas and oil. So what do you have? You have palm oil. So you have massive deforestation, not quite as bad as Indonesia, but deforestation. You have green energy. What I discovered doing this work was solar is owned by the network. Now that doesn't quite get us to climate change, but there's other types of environmental damage.
No, but I think that example should make us very, wary about the implementation of the climate finances. You know, if that can happen on a small scale, what happens when we have hundreds of billions being pledged in, you know, pretty new and diverse and under-regulated channels.
Absolutely.
So it also strikes me, if I may, really quickly, Frederick, that the framework that Sarah used in her book of sort of the key problems and contributing factors apply neatly to the key problems, catastrophic risks you have identified, with corruption being, in a sense, the enabler that Sarah talked about. Perhaps also the way to think about the solutions part, which you deliberately leave out to the latter part of the project, You have chosen, and I've noticed and listened carefully when you describe the catastrophic risks, corruption was not a part of it, but it's pretty clear from the conversation already. They'll probably be the enabling, the contributing factor to a number of things, perhaps something to take into account in a solution. Sarah, can I ask you to hold your horses? I'm conscious of a time. It's 35 minutes to 8, and we did promise
some
to
questions
bring this into a conversation. We have named quite a few countries, including Honduras and Finland and others, so I want to give others chance to come back
like
and push back against you
alcohol.
as well.
No, I want confessions. Come on, guys.
But this is a chance for the audience to ask questions. Before I do so, let me sort of explain the simple rules of the game. We should have microphones around the room. We do. So please wait for the microphone to reach you. As ever, identify yourself. Please tell us who you are. I know many of you, by no means all. Try to keep the questions short and succinct so we can take as many of them as possible, and we'll take them in groups of 3. Frederick, did you have any last
just one
last
point, I think. I mean, obviously, at the very core of global governance is obviously institutions, and it's rather state-centric. But we also see an emergence of a more distributed governance with civil society, with the corporate sector, and with new information technology and so on. There are other ways of addressing some of these risks that we should keep in mind in this discussion as well.
Yeah. And when I looked at the participants list, we had actually a pretty good cross-section of all of those you mentioned, civil society and business as well. So I suspect some of those issues may come up. I already see a first question, the gentleman in the dark suit in the back. And as ever, please try to get my attention. So.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation, Sarah. I'm Charlie Ayala. I'm a researcher pursuant to a PhD. My question is this. Did you find that the same type of situation exists when it comes to humanitarian assistance?
I didn't...
Sarah, can you hold your horses?
Let's say you want to take 3. Sorry.
Just to get more. And the 2 more questions I've seen were right here and then in the back. So first of all, here, if I may.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Paul Flaherty. I'm former, really. Given your points about members of the family in the same public, private and criminal sectors, I'm longing to see your analysis of 19th century London. But to turn Thomas's statistic round, can I ask, why do you think the corruption is so rife in only 30% of the community of nations? And can you name sort of 3 main things that keep the other 70% incorrupt or less corrupt?
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I saw one question in the back on the left, the gentleman in a white shirt.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to listen to your presentations.
Everything I ever learned. Not quite everything, but a lot of it.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Who are you anyway?
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Oussama Diab. I'm a anti-corruption researcher from Egypt. And Sarah, you spoke about judiciary and like going around the judiciary, and you gave actually Egypt as an example. And it's not exactly a question, but I would like to add also like a few themes of corruption when you have a relatively independent judiciary, or sometimes independent pockets within the judiciary, from like the Egyptian experience during the presidency of Sisi. So some of the tricks he did to kind of, and we call this, we try to describe this overall phenomena as neutralizing the judiciary. So when you have an independent judiciary, you try to neutralize it. And in the case of Egypt, this happened through 3 ways, or at least 3 ways. So contracts basically between investors and the state, which in many cases were sometimes between the same person. So a minister in his capacity as a minister would make a contract to give himself land in his capacity as a real estate investor or a real estate developer. And we had this case. And third parties, third-party NGOs or citizens, were allowed to go to administrative court and appeal this contract or say there's something wrong with this contract. Now this has been suspended by Sisi when he had the legislative power, and he prevented any third parties from basically appealing any contract signed by the state. So technically only the state and the investor have the right to go to the court, which obviously they will never do. So NGOs like mine can no longer go to the court and say the state signed a contract that has suspicion of corruption or anything like that. And also reconciliation, which happened, I guess, in Tunisia and in Egypt. So basically, it gives the executive, so even if an investor or a politician was accused of corruption, it basically gives the executive the power to override these court decisions and basically reconcile with the investor.
Can you lead that to a question? Because I want to be fair to the rest of the audience and give them a chance to ask as well.
And also arbitration and BITs, like bilateral investment treaties. So I mean, if Sarah could comment on that very quickly, if she's done research on basically how kind of like bilateral investment treaties and international arbitration overrides national judiciary as a way of neutralizing, even when you have like an independent judiciary. Sorry for taking too long.
No worries. 3 excellent questions. I already registered at least 2 additional ones as ever tried to get my attention. But let's come back to the panel for now. So the last question, what are the mechanisms for overriding the judiciary? What makes the other Paul's question? Why are the other 2/3 of the world not corrupt when corruption is such a good, lucrative business? And humanitarian aid, is it also corrupt or not?
So let me take it in the order in which they were asked. Humanitarian assistance, it's a great question. I haven't looked at it very carefully because I haven't yet done a deep dive on a country that gets it. But there's a bunch of books, not in this type of a context, but if you look at Crisis Caravans, have you ever read that one? Or The Road to Hell, which is quite an old book about Somalia. Part of the problem is we get attached to our halos, And so again, you have this sense that people are starving, or people are dying, and that, So when I got into this business in Afghanistan, the counterpoint was always security. Yeah, later about your corruption stuff, Sarah. First we have to, bring security. It turns out that everybody's primary objective trumps corruption. But people will die if we don't pay off or whatever. Again, let's think about Ebola. And so, of course, once Ebola has broken out, you need to deal with the outbreak. But I'd be very interested to see what follow-up there's been about the health system and the corruption that allowed for the type of health system that created the humanitarian crisis. So my sense is, my instinct is, it's just as bad. I'm not saying only 1/3 of the countries are corrupt. I'm saying only 1/3 of the countries are kleptocracies. And even then, it's probably conservative. It actually is probably a bit more. But as I say, I would put the United States on the continuum. I think Iceland, before the crash of 2008, is a pretty interesting example too, or Ireland. I could wax a little bit philosophical about this. I actually think what's going on these days is the eclipsing by money of other values by which we measure our social value and social standing. And this happens on and off in, I think, human history. I think the late 19th century, early, as you suggested, early 20th century may have been another time. We're living in one of those periods where how you measure your worth tends to be money, regardless of where it comes from. I spent 2.5 weeks in Nigeria asking people, has the meaning of money, social meaning of money, changed in your lifetime? Oh my God, the answers I got. But among them, everyone said yes. But among the answers that were really interesting was, it used to matter where your money came from. And now we are celebrating people who are looting the public treasury. So and humans are competitive animals. We're hierarchical, So once it becomes a competition about money, sky's the limit, right? There's no more, So where I see there being less of a kleptocracy is where, first of all, the institutions and the social value of checks and balances and distribution of power and things like that remain quite strong, but also where the cultural, where the mores around money have remained a little bit more in place. So I think those are things to look at, and I think as we think about how to remedies, which is different from your remedies, but we have to go beyond the technical sort of governmental get money out of politics, or, you know, I mean, some of those things need to happen, but we also have to think about how do we build a vision for ourselves, be it the European Union. I mean, what vision do we put out there that elevates non-monetary values, that remunerates them? So how do we start remunerating people who are doing socially unpleasant, you know, things like caring professions and stuff like that? And how do we remunerate people who have chosen not to have money at the center of their action to a point where they can live decently? You know, how do we elevate other values and then build a vision around those other values that becomes attractive?
Judiciary,
Yeah.
what are the tricks?
Well,
of the
with
trade
bilateral
for-
trade treaties. Now, I haven't actually studied that a lot, but I think it's a great example. So where, you know, and again, often the U.S. is, you know, at the front end of this sphere, where, again, U.S. corporations love to privatize justice. So, okay, let's have a trade treaty where justice is privatized and the judicial function in the other country is overridden. That's not a way to reduce the amount of corruption in the world.
Great. On the second question, I found your answer interesting because essentially what you argued is that you need to remove the temptation of money. Well, money as a temptation and therefore remove the incentive. You gave a slightly different response in a Carnegie podcast to give a bit of free advertising to the Carnegie podcast. In a question to Tom Carver, you essentially argue that we must accept that the temptation will always be there,
Yeah.
that it is a part of human nature, that part of it is corrupt and always desires the nicer suit and the fancier tie. And you have to build your political system in a way that disincentivizes or makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for the corrupt instincts to prevail, and then rewards the other human instincts, the charity, the need for harmony and coexistence. And I don't want to know whether you want to develop it now quickly or whether you want to refer again people to the Carnegie podcast. Your choice.
Well, I actually didn't say that you remove the temptation. I think what I said is money has to be put back in its box, if you will. So it will be tempting, but let's not have it be the only measure by which we, you know, kind of mark our social value. And that's where the incentive structure stuff can actually help. Okay. I mean, some of it is teaching and some of it, but you're exactly right. Of course, there needs to be, I mean, it needs to come out of politics to the extent to which it's currently in politics in a number of countries. The other, I think, really important thing is looking at, are we punishing corruption after the fact? Or are we establishing some mores and even some rules? So again, I use the word emoluments. It's a very interesting thing. In the United States Constitution, there's a rule, again, it's in the Constitution, that government officials may not accept items of value from foreign governments. Now, the point that's so interesting about that is it's not saying a gift from a foreign government is necessarily corrupt. It could genuinely be an act of kindness. I mean, you know, you're a king of France, you know, you wouldn't receive a foreign visitor without offering something to, you know. But the point is here, let's ban those practices which tend to lead toward corruption. The problem with punishing it after the fact is then you get into definitions. What's corruption? So that's where, and recently, again, sorry to keep using these American examples, but they're sort of interesting examples. Last summer, we had a governor who was convicted for corruption. They actually found the quid pro quo. So there was a businessman who gave him $180,000 worth of, you know, stuff of various kinds, loans, gifts of various kinds. And he, in response, made some meetings for this businessman with people. As governor, he called people, you need to meet this guy. Often the meetings were in the governor's palace. So there was a quid pro quo. The Supreme Court ruled last summer 8-0 that this didn't count as corruption because the things that the governor didn't qualify as official acts. An official act, the Supreme Court decided, was like voting or signing a law or something. Okay, when you're in the situation where you have to define things after the fact, or you punish them after the fact, you open yourself up into definitions. So that's sort of what I'm aiming at, is how do you then create, so the French are now considering the law for moralizing political life. Very interesting name of a law. It would, but I found that pretty interesting, that a new president of France, after a campaign that's been marred by corruption issues, not of the type we're talking about, but issues, he actually, the first thing he does is, so it's some of these upstream issues.
Good. I want to bring in more questions, though I noted that all of your suggested solutions were national. Perhaps Frederick will have a point on the global governance solutions, or perhaps you'll tell us that's for later. I want to take a question from each part of the room, beginning with the gentleman in a gray suit.
Thank you. I came from Pakistani administrated Kashmir, and my question to you, madam, is, do you think that the geopolitics is providing any kind of shelter to the corruption in third world or developing countries? Thank you.
I suspect the answer is yes, but you'll get a chance to give us a fuller answer. I saw this gentleman here in the first row first, and then I'll go back. I'll come back in the next round. Right here in the first row. Thank you, sir.
My short question is, how come this whole corruption, again, medical epidemic, or what are the drivers? You went a bit back in your philosophical kind of considerations, touching upon the marketization of everything and the monetization of public goods, of even civic attributes like voting. But all right, what is the source of that? What are the drivers? We know about those two brothers with the short name with a K. How come they are able to impose their way of operating on a democratic system of great tradition, constitutional foundations, etc., etc.? How does this happen?
Let me take a third one in the corner there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jimena Reyes, Director for the Americas at the International Federation for Human Rights. And first, let me thank you for this report. It's going to be so very useful for the work of documentation we do. We have worked with communities in Bahuaguan and in Cuyamel. So I have two small questions. Once you have published the report, have you had any discussion with the Honduras authorities? And if so, what was their reaction to the report? And then second, I'm wondering about, and it would be a way also to mention another country that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, China. One of the documentation we have done in neighboring countries is on the Canal of Nicaragua and the construction. What role, if any, has China in Honduras? Thank you.
Great. So that's really 4 questions from 3 speakers. So, geopolitics, does it play a role in corruption? What are the drivers? How come the evil instincts have dominated over the more benign ones? That's really a question to human nature. What was the Honduras reaction, and China?
I'd like to go to you, though, first with the international. I mean, what is so interesting is the degree to which international, either nations acting on a country, but also multilateral organizations could or could not influence this. So you know, there has been OECD anti-bribery convention and things like that, and yet this other problem of the sort of, once there's a club, and like even EITI, if you guys have heard of that, it's the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and Azerbaijan, they finally got kicked out, but they were, you know, a member in good standing, and so there is a kind of global incentive structure operating on countries. Do you have, I mean, just even thoughts as you've been thinking about, even if it's in a different context, global governance, of how, you know, how do you align the international community, if you will? Hey, do you have any thoughts about that? Or let's like imagine what might help influence the incentive structure?
No, I think it's all about the kinds of incentives. I mean, last time we were able to see a real shift. I mean, a real shift in global governance was after World War II. That's when much of the current institutions were set up, and it was because there was this immense incentive of never again, right? And so now we see them becoming, you know, increasingly obsolete. And I mean, since the new U.S. administration, it's kind of more obvious than ever. And with China stepping in, as it seems, to be willing to take a more active role in both the classical or the traditional global governance institutions, but also setting up new ones. We are seeing a period, I think, where we can see kind of groups taking initiatives and moving forward in different speeds. Something that is popular discussion here in Europe, I know, the possibility of grouping together and moving forward even though everyone is not on board. And I think that's going to be something we will have to see.
That's interesting.
And I think that, I mean, the CO2 might be the new World War II.
Yeah, interesting. Geopolitics is a great question because, you know, and as I've worked, the other thing I wanted to say is part of the reason I designed this thing is, you know, wouldn't it be great if, as we're thinking about carbon, you know, off whatever, the climate transfers money, you know, wouldn't it be great to have, and this is still a schematic version of it, but to have this type of analysis available, and I did it this way because I did work for the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I know what the folder looks like when people are going into cabinet meetings. I mean, we would send him into a meeting. He had the whole background folder, but we'd send him with an 8x5. So what I was trying to think about is how do you concentrate this information in a form that if there was a conversation around a table about, you know, a transfer of a significant amount of money on climate, you know, that you start to understand where is it being transferred to. And so I've suggested to a number of government officials, you know, of different governments, do something like this. And, you know, every time your country is, or your, cabinet is thinking about one of its main partners, at least everyone in the room should have one of these in their folder. And I'm told, oh, that would be too sensitive. Doing the analysis would be too sensitive. Anyway, geopolitics, part of the point is, and initially what I thought I would do with these is talk about political trade-offs, which is sort of like geopolitics. So in this, and they're invisible from where you're sitting, but there are some very faint circles, which what I've decided to call instead of political trade-offs is enabling conditions. So geostrategic concerns can be enabling conditions. So let's take Ukraine. We're all scared of Russia. You know, Russia and Russia's military physical threat against Ukraine is the biggest thing that we care about. That's geostrategic. Therefore, let's forget about the reconstitution of the network under Poroshenko, you know, because poor Ukraine is up against Russia. There's a geostrategic. In the case of Honduras, we've got, I mean, for example, we've got the US demand for narcotics. That's not geostrategic, but it's an enabling condition that absolutely plays into this thing. But you also have US concern about migrants. So what we say is, okay, President Hernandez, close the border for us, and we'll turn a blind eye on. I mean, it's not explicit like that, but it's sort of like that. And of course, what we don't often, the trade-offs are in fact fueled by the very corruption that we choose not so. In other words, what is sending people on the roads north from Honduras? It's a lot of the effects of the corruption that I'm talking about. So what you do is, in order to achieve your kind of geostrategic or immediate objective, it's very self-defeating. You turn a blind eye to the underlying cause of that very thing. I mean, it's the same thing I discovered in Afghanistan, where people would say, bring security, we'll deal with corruption later. And I'm like, people are joining the Taliban because of the corruption in their government. That's why they're joining the Taliban. So you may get the government to help you kill one Talib, but the government's corruption is creating 10 for every. So geostrategic considerations, and in the case of Honduras, a big one was at the time Chavez. And so we were all concerned, the US was concerned about the previous president, or two-back president of Honduras, supposed relationship to Hugo Chavez, which was probably more tenuous than but that's where that kind of thing played. Sorry, drivers of the pandemic. Again, as I said, I think part of it is what I was getting at is a transformed attitude to money, which has happened starting in about the 1980s. And I think Thatcher and Reagan had something to do with it. They rehabilitated money as something that it was, okay and sort of polite to want to get as much of as you could. I think the collapse of communism played into it also. As corrupt as that system was itself, and as abusive as it was, it put a cap on how much stuff somebody at the top of the system could actually acquire and display as his or her own. And it also required the delivery of at least some public goods. So what you start to see in some of the countries that have reacted very strongly against the kleptocratic thing, is that you have a sort of slowing down of the downward distribution of public goods, like in Tunisia, where you had a pretty socialist government, but the public goods were pretty good. And then under Ben Ali, they started. So I think that's part of it. And then you've got all the technical facilitators. So you've got capital controls are all released, money can run around all over the place. You've got secrecy jurisdictions and all that kind of thing, where it suddenly becomes much. So again, back to Afghanistan example, Ahmed Wali Karzai, the younger half-brother of President Karzai, whom I knew very well, you went past his house and you would see a row of shoes outside because all these people went to him for stuff, including money. So he had to distribute some back downwards. But in the old days before capital control, when there were capital controls, almost all of the surplus that was being absorbed by elites was somehow going back into the old country. You didn't get the money flowing outward to the extent that it now is into secrecy havens and stuff like that. Honduran authorities, there's one in the room here, so I think maybe he should have an opportunity to speak if he'd like to. But for the moment, I have not gotten any direct interaction from Honduran authorities. I have from Dinant. So I got a very long letter from Dinant about how everything I had to say about Bayo Aguan is wrong and stuff like that, which I kind of stand by my story. And China in Honduras is not very significant. It's quite interesting. But the report focuses on one particular river, which is a gorgeous river that's being dammed, and that is a Chinese project. But China definitely plays in this very significantly in other countries, where China is very much quid pro quo, right? And so they don't have any issues with this stuff. What's interesting, just the kind of Honduran anecdote on China that was fascinating, is the very dam over which Berta Cáceres was assassinated was initially a Chinese project. Sinohydro, which is the kind of Chinese big hydroelectric dam company, went in there, started working, and immediately saw that the level of public opposition was so great that they didn't want anything to do with it. So they pulled out, and that's what's shocking is even China pulled out of that particular project because of the local disapproval, whereas FMO and FinFund did not until this lady got assassinated.
Good. I promise one more round of questions. We can do that if they are short and succinct. And I see two hands right here in the front row.
Great, thank you. Hello, I'm Silke Hubert from the University of Leuven Center for Citizenship and Democracy. Well, we've been talking a lot about states now, systems, institutions. And what I was wondering now, let's go a bit back to those people that these institutions are supposed to govern. It's citizens. Do you think that citizens of kleptocracies have different perceptions of legitimacy of these institutions and have different levels of actionness? Do they have actionness with regards to countries that have corruption but are not entirely corrupt? Well, like your distinction that you made.
Just for clarification, when you speak of institutions, you mean their own national institutions or international?
Yes, they're national institutions, yeah.
Good question, and there was a question right here.
Yes, Robert van der Mulbroek, former Belgian diplomat. Civil society, a great barrier against kleptocratic regimes. But I wonder, having lived for years in the Gulf area and also in Africa, whether there are countries and kleptocratic regimes that are not beyond salvation. I'm thinking even in a democratic country like Nigeria, there are elections, but $20 billion US dollar disappeared from the oil funds some years ago. How to tackle these countries? Is there any remedy? Is there any point to start such an action? Thank you.
All right. Last chance for any questions or responses. I see none, so let me throw it back to Frederick and to perhaps beginning with Frederick.
Sure. On the point of civil society I mean, in an era of what we know is a significantly shrinking space for civil society in many African countries, for example, to really operate. It's rather depressing to look, to look to the civil society as the kind of counterweight to corruption. But what I've seen from kind of continental governance at the African level is that global governance or continental governance can be an alternative space for civil society to act when it's not possible within the realm of the nation, the national level. And so I do think it's important to really create those kind of platforms for interaction and for accountability when we rethink global governance, because it is working. It's not working really well, but it is telling to be in Addis Ababa and what you're able to talk about outside the compounds of the African Union and what you are actually able to address when you just go into the gates and have meetings within the African Union. A lot of problems with the African Union, I know that. It's not perfect at all, but it is a space really for civil society to engage.
It's really interesting.
Sarah, you have the last words.
So a couple on different views of the legitimacy of institutions. I may not have fully understood your question, but what I found fascinating, having looked at this in countries that you'd think, how many Westerners have told me, oh, well, Afghans, they don't really want to be governed anyway. The whole problem here is that, on the contrary, I mean, I would have Afghans giving me chapter and verse about what they expected their police to do, what they expected their courts to do, and they were up in arms. And so, in a way, there's a disappointment factor that often gets overlooked. People expect a thief to rob you, but they don't expect the police to rob you. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say the very people whose job it is to protect us are the ones who are victimizing us. And so they don't the legitimacy is not who they find illegitimate is the people, not the institutions. Now, this is even true when they are participating in corruption, because they have to on some level. And that's where, again, the sort of civil society answers have to be about how do you help people to almost collective action. But that, taking us to civil society, there have been a remarkable number of anti-corruption, uprisings. Like, let's set aside the Arab Spring and Maidan, which were true revolutions. Let's not forget the Printemps Burkinabé in Burkina Faso, which really was a very similar, really remarkable insurrection. Then you've got Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil, Moldova, Malaysia, Lebanon, Romania. We haven't even gotten into Europe, and it's after 8 o'clock. Oh my God, Romania, and it's really amazing. And governments have fallen. A lot of them have fallen. But you know what? These networks are incredibly resilient. And so that goes to the question of, is it even possible? Because, and at least what I have to say is the first level of civil society response, it's not good enough. Because what it's doing is toppling, even at the best, it's toppling governments. These networks can amputate apart even their own heads in order to survive. So civil society is going to have to get a lot more sophisticated about, okay, how do you actually dismantle the network, or how do you put in place the kind of protective mechanisms to prevent what comes afterwards from playing exactly the same role. And I feel like Tunisia, although Egypt is more spectacular, I feel that Tunisia is also a restoration, frankly. And the other thing I loved about your question is that it allows us to, I think, finish on what another novel thing about this development. It's non-ideological. This is not democracy versus communism. It's not democracy versus autocracy. It's not, we're not up against an ideology here. Democracies can become kleptocracies. And I feel like mine at the moment is uncomfortably close to it. And we're not used to that. We're used to a clash of ideologies. We're also used to an enemy fighting us physically. It's not physical. The kind of kleptocrats here, and it is, I feel like it is spreading, they're not, and in some cases I think it's being deliberately spread. There's a really interesting body of work about whether Putin is actually doing this deliberately, trying to insert it deliberately. But that means cyber war isn't about, the electricity grid coming down. The danger here, so let's go back to your catastrophic danger. I feel like the spread of kleptocracy is a catastrophic threat. But it doesn't take a form that we're used to seeing our threats taking. No. And so we have been taken by surprise. And let's leave it at that.
Wonderful. Well, many thanks to Frederick for sharing the ideas on how to improve global governance, or at least the process, if not the solutions, and for introducing the prize. Many thanks to Sarah for introducing the concept of her book and then warning us of a new kind of kleptocracy that we underestimate at our own risk. And above all, many thanks to you for coming and for participating in a debate. There's a chance to ask follow-on questions in a one-on-one, but for now, please join me in thanking the speakers.